Ben Shapiro is the co-founder and editor emeritus of the Daily Wire and host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the largest and fastest growing conservative podcast and radio show in the nation. In addition, he also hosts Debunked, Ben Shapiro's book club, The Search, and the Ben Shapiro Sunday Special. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ben Shapiro.
Thank you. Thank y'all for coming out. Thank you guys so much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here at University of Michigan. I want to thank Charles. I want to thank Young America's Foundation for making this happen. And I want to thank you guys for being here for what will be the second most important speech in American history. The current president, or former president of the United States, already says that in about an hour here, he's going to give, he literally said this in his email, the most important speech in all of American history. It goes like Trump announcing that he's going to run again, the Gettysburg Address, I Have a Dream. That's the order in which this moves. Unless actually it is the most important speech in American history, it could theoretically happen, and maybe he's announcing that he's either bringing back the McRib, or could be a cold fusion. He's finally broken the code. In his off hours, while he's been not president, he's been at work working on his cold fusion reactor, and finally, he's achieved the impossible dream. I don't think so, but you don't know. Okay, so what I'm here to talk about tonight is the Great Reset. Now, you've heard a lot of people talk about the Great Reset before because you've heard this slogan put out there a lot. And you've heard a lot of people say the Great Reset is a conspiracy theory. The Great Reset is not a conspiracy theory unless people are expressing it as conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theory is that a bunch of people got together in a room, they concocted COVID-19, they unleashed it on the world, and they did so in order to completely restructure all of society. Okay, that's not true. Okay, it may have been concocted in a lab, may have been concocted by Chinese scientists in a lab, we'll find that out. It may have been unleashed on the world by the Chinese government. That's also actually less speculation and more reality, according to Scott Gottlieb at the FDA. It's pretty obvious that the Chinese allowed the Wuhan virus to actually escape Wuhan. But the idea that this was concocted by Klaus Schwab and his friends over at the World Economic Forum in order to restructure society is not true. What is true is that there are a group of elites in our society, in governments of Western states, in the media, in the halls of academia, who would like to radically remake civilization, and they will seize on opportunities to do so. So it's not they're releasing the Black Plague in order to then fight the Black Plague by restructuring society. It's that something breaks out, it's really bad, and now we have the opportunity to remake society in the way that we would like to remake society. The term the Great Reset is not a right-wing term. That is a term that started with the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. The World Economic Forum is highly successful in bringing all sorts of very important people together. This is where you hear about the Davos Economic Summit every year. And you see heads of government and major corporate leaders, and for some odd reason, the guy from FTX over at Davos, and all these people get together and they figure out exactly how they're going to restructure society. The declared mission of the WEF is to foment the acceptance of so-called stakeholder capitalism. This is their big cause, stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism suggests that all parts of society are to take account of the generalized interests of society in determining how to act. So if you run a corporation, you're supposed to not take into account predominantly the interests of your shareholders, the people who own your stock. Instead, what you're supposed to do is look out over the broad panoply of humanity, and you're supposed to say to yourself in the cockles of your own heart, what does humanity want of me? Because you've all been granted this magical ability. And sort of like Rousseau's general will, we all have the ability to see the general will. We don't do it through voting, we don't do it through polling. You just have the magical ability to determine what all of humanity wants from you. And this means that you get to ignore your own shareholders. Klaus Schwab, who's the head of the World Economic Forum, has been since 1971 the chief advocate of what he calls stakeholder capitalism. And he's defined it. He says a company serves not only its shareholders, but all of its stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, local communities, society at large. And therefore, your job isn't to figure out how to best serve your customers or how to make a great product. Your job is to figure out how to better society using the resources of your company. Now, this philosophy of corporate governance is entirely at odds with what had been the dominant corporate model of the past few decades. That was called shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism was an idea that was promoted by the economist Milton Friedman. Friedman stood foursquare against what he called the social responsibilities of business. He said that the term social responsibilities of business, this is so vague as to mean absolutely nothing. Instead, basically, if you say social responsibilities of business and you're a CEO, what you mean is you're not going to deliver on any metrics. You don't have to sell a certain amount of product. You don't have to be more innovative. You don't have to generate a certain profit margin. You can just say, I have fulfilled my social responsibility, and you can be the world's crappiest CEO. When CEOs like Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX do this, and they call it effective altruism, this is what they're doing. When they scam a bunch of money and then they give $40 million to Democrats in the last midterm election cycle, and then everybody sort of looks the other way until it all breaks wide open, that's what they're doing. They're bettering the world with the money of their shareholders and maybe some of the people who are trading on FTX, maybe through fraudulent means. It's all an outgrowth of this idea that you have to use whatever resources are at your disposal, including resources that don't actually belong to you, to change the world. Now, what Milton Friedman pointed out was that a corporate executive typically has direct responsibility to his employers, those would be stockholders in a company, to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, right? When you own stock, you generate a vote, you vote for the CEO and the board, and they are supposed to take account of the fact that they are answerable to you, the stockholder. Their job is to provide for you the best return on your investment. If you make corporate executives responsible to some other set of priorities, this frees them from accountability entirely. Shareholders aren't owed a duty by executives, so society can't punish them for failing to perform their supposedly broad duties. This means that they have all the responsibility and none of the accountability. Because if the shareholders say you're doing a bad job, they say, well, I wasn't answering to you. That wasn't my job. I answered to society. And if society says you're doing it, how exactly is society going to say you're doing a bad job? There's no way. Society doesn't have one voice, so none of this works. Friedman says that anybody who claims the responsibility to do good with somebody else's money is actually usurping a government function. Typically, we vote on things like this. Right? If we want to collectively perform a responsibility, we vote on raising our own taxes or siphoning money off from a particular source, and then we use it in particular ways. But when corporations do this sort of thing, they're just stealing the money. If a corporation takes shareholder dollars and uses it for whatever the CEO wishes to do, typically we would call this fraud. But this is something that has been pushed by the World Economic Forum. It's been pushed by Davos, by Klaus Schwab. Because, again, the idea here is that they know better than you, and they are going to remake society. Stakeholder capitalism advocates collusion and regulatory capture. Whereas shareholder capitalism suggests that you are acting on behalf of your shareholders, and this means the companies are going to act in competition with one another. They're going to compete to create the best products and the best services at the best possible price. They're going to out-earn their competitors. Stakeholder capitalism suggests the opposite, because you're not answerable to the people who actually own the company. Instead, you're going to get together with all the other special people over at Davos, and you're going to get in a room, and you're going to make policy, and you're going to collude, and then you're going to get together with government actors, and they're going to give you special benefits. And together, you're going to form what is sort of an economically fascist coterie to help restructure all of the world's economic systems, all of the world's social systems. Now, here's the thing. I say this and it sounds conspiratorial, but Klaus Schwab just says it out loud. In June 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, Schwab penned a piece at the World Economic Forum website. It was called, "Now It's Time for a Great Reset." To avoid global crisis, Schwab wrote, quote, "The world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our societies and economies, from education to social contracts and working conditions. Every country, from the United States to China, must participate. Every industry, from oil and gas to tech, must be transformed. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism." And Schwab said that this would require stronger and more effective government, as well as private sector engagement every step of the way. Some of the practical things he suggested were getting rid of GDP as a measure of actual economic growth. And so instead of looking at how much spending goes on in society, GDP is a very flawed measure, but it's the best measure we currently have. He suggested that we get rid of GDP as a measure of growth. Instead, we ought to look at things like climate action, sustainability, inclusivity, global cooperation, health and well-being. You can't make a metric out of that. There's no way to actually measure those things. What he's doing is making himself completely unanswerable in pursuit of a broader agenda. In fact, Schwab actually said the quiet part really out loud. He said that we should actively work to decrease economic growth. He said, quote, "We might even find we can live with such a scenario quite happily." Which sounds great to Klaus Schwab, who's living high on the hog over at Davos, but to everybody else who's struggling to pay their bills because of inflation, that the negative growth in GDP doesn't sound like a particularly wonderful idea. The goals that Schwab wants are actually pretty malignant. He doesn't like growth. Instead, he says every single country ought to pursue a broader, if not universal, protection of social assistance, a move toward enhanced protection for workers in the form of mandatory benefits, bigger spending, more regulation. He says governments will, quote, "decide that it's in the best interest of society to rewrite some of the rules of the game and permanently increase their roles." And of course, he relies on the young, always the young, very old German fellow, relying on the young people to jog everybody into action. He's relying on the people who are gluing their heads to paintings. Those are the people who are going to spur us to action, because we're going to then say the only way to buy off these crazy people who are throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh, the only way to get Greta Thunberg to stop being angry at you, is we have to give her what she wants. That's the only way. And that will also be the best insurance policy against the rise of populism, because if we act, then everybody will be satisfied, and then there won't be any more right-wing leaders in any of these countries. All of our problems will be solved. Now, here's the thing. What Klaus Schwab is preaching in the Great Reset is really nothing new. We've seen it on a national level. We just haven't seen it on an international level. On a national level, from about the 15th century to the 18th century, this was just called mercantilism. This is the idea that the government was going to run trade policy. The government was going to give monopolies to particular companies. The government was going to decide based on balance of trade whether the country was doing it generally well or generally poor. They could control every area of the economy, but there would be private ownership of property. And then in the 20th century, this became economic fascism. And economic fascism was basically historically indistinguishable. I'm talking about the actual economic program of Mussolini's Italy, or Hitler's Germany, or for that matter, FDR's New Deal. These programs were largely indistinguishable on an economic level. Obviously, the regimes were very distinguishable, but the economic program was rather indistinguishable. The idea was that government was basically going to make all the rules. There were going to be a few corporations that really benefited. These corporations were going to do extraordinarily well so long as they kissed the ring of the government in power. So there's nothing new about the idea of centralizing power in government and then using government to work hand in glove with corporations in a sort of corporatist format. What is different is that this is now international. Because theoretically, you would think this wouldn't work internationally, right? China's in competition with the United States is in competition with Russia, Canada's in competition with nobody, right? I mean, this is just the way that it works. But this is where the corporations come in, and this is what's kind of scary about our current economic moment, is that the leaders in the Great Reset are not actually governmental actors who would be answerable to you and to me, right? We could vote them out. The people who are supposed to lead the way are the corporations. They're international corporations who are functioning in a wide variety of countries. They're the ones who are supposed to cram down on everybody else what the rules of the road are. Nations are going to agree on sort of a general global scheme of how the economy is going to work with regard to these corporations, and then these corporations will force social change. And the governments will say, we don't even have our hands on that. It's not us. It's these corporations. And if you get kicked off of a social media platform, that's not us. It's a social media platform. If you get debanked, it's not us. It's just the bank that's doing this. This is the problem with having corporations as the chief policymakers anywhere in the world, and particularly in the United States, particularly when they are backed by the subtle promise of government intervention and government help. It's a major problem. You know, there's a reason that BlackRock, for example, which is run by Larry Fink, is a member of the World Economic Forum. BlackRock is one of the biggest investors on nearly every major corporation in the United States. They control hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. It's amazing how strong BlackRock, State Street, many of these funds are. And many of your states are invested via BlackRock in a wide variety of stocks and bonds and all the rest of it. Well, Larry Fink makes very clear that he's in favor of what he calls shareholder capitalism. Or stakeholder capitalism, rather. He says stakeholder capitalism is not about politics. It's not a social or ideological agenda. It's not woke. The stakeholders your company relies upon to deliver profits for shareholders need to hear directly from you, the corporate heads, the greatest and the wisest of all beings. Again, Great Reset advocates claim that they have to remake the world. Now, they have some holes in their system. So, for example, they're not going to say anything to China about climate change or human rights abuses. They won't do that because that might undercut their actual bottom line. They still have to make their money. But they will claim that they ought to be given the outsized power to reshape everybody's life. And this is why they're so focused in on climate change. It's why you see ESG scores and DEI scores, and all of this is supposed to excuse what corporations are doing all around the world as they involve themselves in human rights predations. Now, the fact that corporations are working hand in glove with government right now should be a very scary thing to all of us. Now, Klaus Schwab, in his last book, The Great Narrative, he quotes a Malaysian business person and founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, a guy named Chandran Nair. And he basically gives the game away. Here's what he says, quote, I think the idea that by 2050, 6 billion Asians can and should aspire to live like Europeans and Americans through a consumption, resource-intense model is essentially a big lie. And therefore, we must redefine the notion of how those people in a climate or carbon-constrained world have access to basic rights. I think that's a conundrum today. How do we deal with it? We can't deal with it through pious statements and market instruments, but with draconian rules. And those rules won't be provided by markets, but only by institutions of society, call it the state. So corporations start the process and then governments finish it. Corporations change the rules of the game. Corporations decide what you can and cannot do. backed by government, and then government steps in to finally remake the world in its own image with its favored corporations who are all going to make a bunch of money off the back of this. And if you oppose these folks, then you are the obstacle. Now, you can see the early iterations of this. You can see it on social media, as I mentioned, with various bannings of people for no good reason. This is why it's actually quite a good thing that Elon Musk took over Twitter and was reopening the spigot on the flow of information on Twitter. But this is scary. When you see, for example, the Canadian trucker convoy being debanked, when you see people who give money there being literally taken off their bank accounts, we should be frightened. When you see credit card companies suddenly refusing to allow you to perform certain transactions, legal transactions with your credit card. You can buy porn with your credit card, but you can't buy a gun with your credit card. Because God forbid you should be able to use your American Express to legally use your Second Amendment right. This sort of stuff should frighten you. When you see Amazon Web Services denying server space to Parler on the back of January 6th on the basis of literally nothing, this should be very concerning. If corporations are fully activated in the name of the Great Reset, the fallout's going to be catastrophic, and the blowback is going to be really, really severe. But here's the thing. The Great Reset can, in fact, be stopped. It has to be stopped in a couple of ways. One, you have to vote out of government the people in government who are backing this sort of stuff. Didn't do a very good job of that last week. But hopefully in the future, we'll do better. You're starting to see it in a wide variety of countries, particularly in Europe, which have decided to kick back against the Great Reset environmentalism that has now put them under the thumb of, weirdly enough, Russian oil and natural gas. Those governments have to be answerable to the people. And second of all, competition. And yes, in cases where there is actual collusion between governments and corporations, that collusion has to be broken. Using the mechanisms of the state to stop the state from involving itself in corporatism is not, in fact, big government action. It's an attempt to restore the status quo ante. And that's something we should all support. So when we look at theories like the Great Reset, when we look at people saying the Great Reset isn't happening, we shouldn't be afraid of it, we shouldn't be afraid of people in small rooms figuring out how things are going to work, understand, sometimes that stuff is conspiracy theory and sometimes it really isn't. And when they're saying it out loud, and when they're saying they want to reshape every aspect of the global economy in the name of some great cause, they're lying to you. What they really want is power, and that's something we should all work to deny them. Happy to take your questions on this or any other topic. I believe there's a microphone there.
Alrighty, we're going to be transitioning into the Q&A portion of our program tonight. If you'd like to ask a question, you can please line up in this row over here. And when you get to the mic, please state your name and a brief question. When you're finished, you can head to the back and then return to your seat.
And one more proviso. As per my usual rule, if you disagree with this or anything else I say, feel free to raise your hand and you'll be moved to the front of the line.
All right, thank you very much for your speech. I think we all appreciated it here, so another round of applause would be appropriate. My question pertains to the short term as opposed to the long term. When we look at things right now, we see that there are a lot of things that could use some short-term attention. We see that on, say, the abortion front. We also see, like the pro-life front, we also see, when we're looking sort of in the long term, we also see things like education, which are going to be deeply important, and what happens today in the classroom is going to have real manifestations 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And so what is your take on how we should be focusing our energy on the short term and then also the long term, because they are both very important?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of those questions is less a time frame question than a tactical question. One of them is a time frame question. So when it comes to education, that's a time frame question because obviously, as you say, what happens now is going to affect how kids are thinking next year, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And that requires an immediate solution. It's why I'm a donor to the 1776 Project, which is run by Ryan Godersky. That's an organization that is dedicated to putting people who respect traditional values and solid American history on school boards around the country. I think that's deeply, deeply important, and I'm glad to see that a lot of parents are waking up to this. So that's just a question of get active now, and the best dollars you spend in politics and the time you spend in politics may be better focused on your school board than it is on a local congressional race or even a senatorial or gubernatorial race. When it comes to the pro-life issue, I think that one is a question of tactics. So I think strategically, pro-lifers are all on the same page. I'm the most pro-life person that I know, right? I'm a clear and obvious believer in the idea that a child has rights, a preborn human being has rights from literally the moment of conception. Okay? Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that every single political situation is going to prove itself fertile to that full-scale argument. And I think what we've seen in a bunch of states is that the people of those states are not ready to make the move toward banning abortion full scale, and instead what you end up with is precisely the reverse of what you're trying. So you can either push for 100% and get 0%, or maybe you push for 30% and get 30%, and then next week you push for 40%, and it's terrible. I mean, I wish also that I could wave a magic wand and suddenly pro-life laws would be the rule of the land, but that's not the way that it works. Now, you're seeing this differential approach in a variety of different states. So, for example, I believe in Michigan, you had a snapback law, right? You had a snapback law on abortion that recently got overturned by a constitutional amendment in this state that essentially enshrined abortion in law. That was a mistake by the Republican legislature. They should have proposed a heartbeat bill. They should have proposed some replacement for the snapback law that was more acceptable to the public opinion, because the public opinion might have gone with that, but they didn't go with that. Instead, they went all the way to the other side. Okay, what you've seen in Florida, by contrast, is Florida was a purple state. It's now moving very strongly red. Right now, the law in Florida is way too permissive on abortion for my taste. It's a 15-week abortion ban, which is super late. I mean, that's later than most of Europe at this point. What you're going to see in the new legislative session, I would imagine, is that a gradual incremental move back toward the point of conception is going to happen. And that's going to get people used to it. And I think that that actually is a smart tactical move. Again, this is a question of tactics, not a question of strategy. Strategically, we are all on the same page. We have the same goal. The question is a tactical one. How do you hope to achieve that goal? And is shouting louder really going to win you the day? Or are you going to end up with the reverse of what you were seeking to do in the first place?
Thank you very much, Ben.
Hello, my name's Brad. I'm here representing a lot of the progressive students here at UMich. And I just have to, I wanted to know your stance on trans people as a whole, and then I'd like to maybe have a conversation, a short one about
Sure.
what you believe.
Well, first of all, thanks for coming in and asking a question nicely. That's great. I mean, sometimes we don't get that. I mean, my stance on trans people is I'd like to characterize this differently. I think that there's a few different categories here, and everybody's lumping everybody together in one category. There are people who have long-standing gender dysphoria, right, or gender identity disorder, right? That's a real active disorder that does exist. Okay, that does not mean that these people are members of the opposite sex. Okay, this is where I reject the argument that if you have gender dysphoria, you have an actual mental disorder under the DSM-5. This means that if you're a man who believes you're a woman, this makes you a woman. You're not a woman, you're a man who believes you're a woman. I have tremendous sympathy for that difficult body dysmorphic condition. That does not make you a member of the opposite sex, because only objective biological reality can make you a member of one sex or another sex. Then there are people who claim to be members of sexes that don't exist, who claim pronouns that don't exist, who claim that they are gender fluid, which is not really a thing or has never really been characterized. There are folks who claim that without any evidence whatsoever that they have gender identity disorder, and that suddenly they discover at the age of 15 that they're gender questioning, but there's not really a persistent level of belief that has lasted for a persistent series of time, and people are being given testosterone or being given surgeries on the basis of this. And then there are people who are intersex, which again is another category. And I think what happens in these conversations, people tend to conflate all these categories. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, trans people exist. And I'll say, okay, so what do you mean by that? And they'll say, well, there are certain people who have Klinefelter syndrome. Okay, those are not trans people. Those are intersex people. That's a completely different category. Those are people who have an actual biological condition. They still happen to be a member of one sex, by the way. They're still sexed.
Yeah.
They just happen to have secondary sexual characteristics of the other sex. Okay, so that's my general perspective.
Yeah, I think for sake of brevity, I think we'd be able to have a conversation about gender. And I really fail to understand how you claim that there's a lot of genders that are made up, and this is. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? I think
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think that there's been a false distinction that's been made between sex and gender, and then gender has been read in as more important than sex. So basically, the idea of gender was a concept that was brought up by a college professor named John Money back in the 1960s, and the basic idea is that gender was a set of cultural characteristics that we impose on people of a particular sex. So it's not that women have babies, it's that women are gendered as though they have babies, and this is what makes a woman a woman. Okay, that's not correct. Women have babies. Or we'll say that gender is a series of characteristics that we put, it's a series of stereotypes, essentially. But then you'll see the trans community argue that if a boy has stereotypical attributes of this gender, this makes them a member of the opposite sex, which doesn't make sense. You can have effeminate boys. You can have masculine girls. I mean, this has been a feature of life for all of human history. That doesn't make them a member of the opposite sex. So when people say gender, what I want them to do is define what they mean by gender. If they just mean a set of culturally attributable attributes, And they say that that's completely separate from sex. First of all, I reject that. I think there is a strong correlation between gendered behavior and sex.
Yeah, I mean, that's how we socialize children. I mean, I think it's a pretty, the connection's there, and I don't think it goes
It's not all
further.
socialization is the argument that I would make, and that's backed by the fact that in the primate kingdom, for example, there are heavily gendered areas of behavior. The notion that basically boys and girls when they're born are androgynous widgets, and then we make a boy by giving him a truck, and make a girl by giving her a doll, that's not true on any sociological level.
Again, I find it really... So we just clapped for Ben comparing primates to humans. I want to establish that. And then on top of that...
Well, I mean, I'm talking about the attribute of mammalian biology, so yes. In fact, I will argue, I'll compare human beings to literally any member of the mammalian species when we are talking about sexual dichotomy, which is the basis of all reproduction in mammalian species, yes.
Yeah, okay, but I do want to bring it back to the concept of socialization in children.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked a long time in public schools. I've noticed that students, this gender line that we're speaking of, the binary that you were referring to, I think many of us fall within those two lines, man and woman. I'm not saying it's you either have one piece of genitalia or the other. I'm saying like we have masculine and feminine traits throughout that we pick up from our family, the world around us.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm feeling, if you agree with that.
But that's not what makes you a man or a woman. If a boy likes dolls, that doesn't make him a girl.
Okay.
And if a girl likes trucks, that doesn't make her a boy. And I feel that we're doing grave damage to kids by arguing the opposite.
I think we should allow them the space to explore that. If
I mean, by the way,
Yeah.
I don't, first of all, I do think that it is very important to provide rules for kids. I think the idea that kids are to be sort of left out there in the wild and then they do whatever they do,
Yeah.
we don't treat them like that with nutrition, we don't treat them like that with education, we don't treat them like that with a lot of things. And the idea of teaching boys to actually embrace their boyhood, I think is quite a good thing. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are kids who are, as I say, boys who will be more effeminate, and they shouldn't be bullied for that or mistreated for that.
Yeah.
But to suggest that this makes them trans or makes them a member of the opposite sex is the thing I'm really arguing against, because that ends in a lie that leads to suicidal ideation, it leads to tremendous confusion, it leads to tremendous psychic pain. You're telling a lie to a kid, and lying to kids is not something I'm very much in favor of.
Yeah, and I think, speaking on suicidal ideation, I think maybe denying the fact that, like, it's okay for, a young person to decide if they fall within a certain gender line. I fail to understand how that affects you personally and how that hurts the child.
Right. So anytime society sets a rule, it affects me personally. You're not asking me how a kid in Saskatchewan identifying affects me personally. You're asking me to go along with the lie that kid's personal subjective sense of identity shapes the definition of sex, and that I refuse to go along with. Because as you say, kids are in fact malleable. And the notion that we're supposed to teach all 5-year-old kids that you can be a member of the opposite sex is deeply disturbing, chaotic, and wrong.
Again, and that's not what I'm prescribing. I'd like to be clear that what I'm saying is they should be allowed to explore whatever portion of
if by allow you,
traits.
it depends. If by allow you mean, do I think the kids should be like locked in the Matilda chokey for playing with a doll or something?
No,
obviously not.
That's
child
the case
abuse.
often. Yeah, in very orthodox spaces. Let's be honest.
Child abuse is illegal, and it should be illegal. Okay, but the notion that if my kid expresses gender confusion, that I'm not allowed to say to my kid, my son comes home and he says one day you're a girl, and he says I'm a girl, and I say to him you're not a girl, that's biologically untrue, you're a boy. When you're a kid, you're confused in your feelings. The idea that that's a form of child abuse is a lie. That is not a form of child abuse. That's actually how you parent.
Yeah, and again, I'm allowing you that space, but on the other hand, you're opposing the very opposite. You're saying that it's sick and twisted for parents to allow their kids to explore different parts of themselves.
It is sick and twisted to present kids with the notion that boys and girls are not separate in humanity, and that boys and girls are not two separate and dichotomous forms of the species Homo sapiens, and that the idea that there is no biological reality to that whatsoever, so that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy, that is a form of child abuse. That is the same thing as me teaching my kid that my kid can be a horse. My kid cannot be a horse. That is not real. And if I were to teach my kid and take seriously the argument that my kid could be a horse, I'd be doing them tremendous psychic damage. I'm sorry, I feel like we're kind of running out of time here, but
Yeah.
I really appreciate
Could I just get one more thing?
Sure, well, go for it.
Again, I'd like to. We're making comparisons to animals, and you're getting a chant for it. And again, it's not my favorite thing.
Yes,
but
because
but I appreciate your point in saying that you would be willing to allow another family to let their child explore certain genders.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't allow a child to explore the lie that they can be a member of the opposite sex.
Oh, there you
but
go.
if they want,
Yeah,
if they become, I disagree with the basic idea of quote unquote genders entirely. If the idea, because if you're going to degrade everything down to the behavior of human beings, then we all have our own genders. Literally every single human, we could just have names. We can get rid of the idea of gender entirely, and I can just call you Bob, right? I mean, like we can all have our own. That's the easiest way to do this. We treat each other as individuals with a bevy of different attributes, rather than saying my gender is pansexual, fluid, 45, XYZ, right?
That's so dishonest.
How is that dishonest?
You're making this this straw man about pansexual gender.
No, I mean
that's not the reality. It isn't, and you know it is.
So you do it. You name a gender that you think exists outside of male and female.
No, I agree that people can lie within the bounds.
Okay, well, again, I really appreciate the time of the back and forth. I think it is productive, and I appreciate you doing it.
Yeah, no, and again, I don't believe any of you have malice views. I think a lot of your views are founded in the reality of the world. But I hope that you at least would allow yourselves to come out to some of the more progressive groups and maybe have these conversations.
By the way, having conversations like this, I encourage everybody who's conservative to have these kind of conversations to go on the other side.
That was my intent in coming here. And seeing how hard you guys were on the protesters out there who were using their First Amendment right was really tough to watch, especially for Americans who claim that the First Amendment is something that you co-sign. I'm sorry, but I have to say it.
I wasn't out there, so if anybody was mistreated as a protester, then I apologize on behalf of whoever mistreated a protester.
Hi, hello. I'm Rahul. I'm also like my friend here, also on the left, and I still appreciate that you came to talk. While I don't agree with you, I still agree that we should have these conversations. From your talk on the Great Reset, I can't help but noticing that it still feels like a conspiracy, in the sense that nothing what you said from the Schwab quotes, etc., lead me to believe that all these companies will start driving policy. If leaders like Biden agree, we're still electing them, and so it still follows that they're saying that, hey, they'd like to see this change happen just like you do, just like I do.
Okay, so these corporations are driving policy hand in glove with governments that are helping them out. So, for example, there are a bunch of these corporations that have, for example, like the Biden administration has tried to press the idea that if you want to be traded publicly, then you have to be ESG scores. Okay, ESG scores, environmental social governance scores, have nothing to do with what your company actually does. They have to do with how you are going to be given points on an environmental scale. And what that really is it's an attempt to disincentivize investment in, for example, fossil fuels. It's an attempt to incentivize investment in green policy. Well, that's a subsidy. I mean, it's a backdoor subsidy for green companies, and it's a desubsidization of oil and natural gas, which has dramatic ramifications for energy prices, for example, which we've seen over the course of the last couple of years. Now, that sort of policy has real effects on everyday life. I mean, it's kind of boring stuff, but it does have real effects on how people live, what they pay at the pump, the economic growth of the entire globe. When there's a serious economic crisis, like there has been in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, where suddenly there's great shortages of oil and natural gas, it turns out a lot of this ESG policy has some pretty dire ramifications. Right? That sort of policy making has reality, has real life consequences, and that's a problem.
So if the government wants to incentivize all these if it wants to go against oil and fossil fuels, I think that's completely fine. Again, we're still electing the government. I don't...
If you want to elect the government to literally just restrict oil and fossil fuel leases, you can do that. I mean, people did that with Biden, right? Biden actually said he was going to do that, and then he did do that, and then he claimed he didn't do that, and he claimed it was Putin's fault, but he did do that, right? So that is at least answerable. The problem is when you have companies acting hand in glove with the government and essentially being told that to do so, they will be part of the wave of the future. Here's our policy. Our policy from the government is to push investment in green. So now here's a subsidy via the Infrastructure Act for your green policy. Like that sort of stuff. It's amazing to me that Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, if you go back this far, I'm a little older than you guys, but when you look at those two movements, theoretically they should have been on the same page. The problem is they were arguing with different sides of the aisle. The Tea Party was saying government shouldn't be subsidizing hedge funds and bailing them out. And Occupy was also saying the same thing, but then they were blaming the hedge funds. What I'm saying is you blame both, right? Everybody is at blame here. When you get in bed with the government, you engage in corporatism that undercuts competition and makes your company do bad policy in pursuit of some higher and broader social goal. What you're really doing is ignoring the will of your own shareholders. And when you ignore the will of your own shareholders, you're betraying a fundamental trust of the people who gave you the money and put you in charge of those companies in the first place.
Sure,
That's the argument.
Sure, but if a company wants to act in accordance with, say, what society has or what society finds important, I don't think that's necessarily bad as long as they're still fulfilling.
Well, it depends what they're doing. I mean,
Sure.
I agree with you. If the question is, can corporations act in a political way? Sure, corporations can act in a political way, but they shouldn't lie about what it is that they are doing. Right? They should be very clear about what it is that they're doing and why they are doing it. If Klaus Schwab wants to green the earth, he shouldn't pretend that he's doing so on behalf of the entire earth or on behalf of shareholders. He should say, I want to green the earth. This is my priority. I'm doing it with your money. Just say that. Why is that so dishonest? That'd be more honest.
So, sorry, if I may go back to something that we said before, it sounds like these are subsidies that a company can get, but it's not like if a fossil fuel company is something that it will not be able to get, but they get subsidies from the government, which I'm sure you and I may both won't agree with that as well. Actually, I don't know if we'll agree with that or not, but.
Well, I mean, they get oil and gas leases from the government. The actual profit margins for the oil and gas companies for years and years and years were actually fairly low because of the lack of investment, the disincentives created by the federal government investing in these things. Sure. It's only the last couple of years they've had really good profits.
Sure. Well, sorry, I'll finish with this.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll finish with this because I know that other people are not. But it just sounds like the criteria of ESG scores, as you say, it just seems like it's a subsidy that's available for whoever meets this criteria.
Yes, but the question is who's designing the criteria and why? And pretending that there is public approval for the designation of those criteria at a market level is not true. The entire market doesn't want to do this, which is why it's dangerous when you start getting government involved in the skewing of the markets. Because the normal response for this on a market level was, you want to pursue ESG, fine, go ahead and do it. And then my friend Vivek Ramaswamy will launch a rival fund to BlackRock, and that's fine. They'll go into competition. They won't do the ESG stuff. They'll just do all of the same investment, but without the ESG. That's all fine and good until you have the government that is working hand in glove with BlackRock, and BlackRock paying money in order to get those people elected, and those people using government power in order to foster BlackRock's agenda. That's a problem.
I mean the market. I mean,
I've never heard one of the things that's very weird about this is the left usually doesn't like the close cooperation between government and corporations. Suddenly the left is very much in favor of close cooperation between government and corporations, which is strange to me.
It's regulation, like that's completely fine. That's
yes, but it's regulation on behalf of certain particular corporations who are willing to do the dirty work on behalf of the government. I mean, it's payoffs.
It's a subsidy.
Yes, I don't like those.
It's a subsidy for people who qualify.
Yes, I don't like those. Correct. And that's why I said at the end, there are two ways to fight this. One is that you go into competition with these companies, and two is you don't elect these people anymore.
I disagree that it's as sinister as you say it is, just because it's a subsidy.
Well, I mean, I think the agenda is sinister. You may think that it's clean how they do it. That's fine, but it's a sinister. In my opinion, it is a sinister agenda to try to remake the single greatest economic system, bringing global prosperity, capitalism, on behalf of a bizarre notion of zero growth in order to achieve greater global economic equality, or whatever it is that Klaus Schwab and company want.
Right. Well, I really appreciate this. I could keep going, but...
Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, moving forward, let's try to keep this to one brief question, all right?
Hi, I really wanted to thank you for coming out today, and specifically for talking to those who have different viewpoints than your own. I'm not looking to argue with you. I just want to know about the ideology as to why you think that a woman shouldn't have the right to her own bodily autonomy in regards to abortion.
A woman should have the right to her own bodily autonomy, but not to kill another human. That's the simple answer. So, there are... I've never cared about a woman's right to do as she pleases with her esophagus. I've never cared about a woman's right to do as she pleases with her kidney. None of this has ever bothered me one iota. I do have a problem with what she decides to do with another human life with potential. In order to really have this argument or this discussion, we sort of have to get our premises straight. I think one of the things that happens is that the pro-choice side argues directly by the pro-life side and vice versa. So on the pro-choice side, the argument is there is nothing of value in there, so who cares what you do with it? And on the pro-life side, the answer is there is something of essentially infinite value in there, so it matters an awful lot what you do with it. Those two premises are completely incompatible. And there's not really an in-between, so to speak. Right, so this is why the battle is so hard fought, but this is why attributing motive to people who are pro-life, suggesting what you really want to do is invade women's bodily autonomy. That's your actual goal. It's not to protect the human life. Your actual goal is you need to control women. You want to control women. I don't care. Frankly, I'm not known for my caring. I care about my immediate family, some members of my community, that's about it. But as far as the idea that I'm like sitting awake at night thinking, how do I control women's bodies? No, not really, not at all, actually. The thing that I do care about is the preservation of human life. So I don't have an argument that pro-choicers are ignoring a premise. That's fine. You're allowed to ignore a premise or think a premise that I'm giving is wrong. What I don't like is the attribution of motive, which is what you're actually doing, is Handmaid's Tale trying to control women and destroy our lives. First of all, it turns out that the vast majority of women for literally all of human existence have engaged in childbearing and rearing, and it has not, in fact, ruined their lives. In fact, married women with children are, by poll data, the happiest women in America. I know this runs counter to a lot of...
All right, thank you for the straw man fallacy. Thank you.
I missed what she actually said. What was it? Straw man?
Straw man fallacy, I think.
You can't just shout straw man and run away. Do you want to come back and explain why it was a straw man, or no? Okay, you're just going to run away. Okay. All right.
Good evening, Ben. My name's Andrew. I'm a Navy vet. Using my GI Bill to get my degree on campus. I just want to thank you for your service to our country. You're a patriot. Really love you, man.
I just talk for a living, man. You actually did something, so it's a different thing.
Well, thank you. My question is, I don't know if you're up to date on the situation in Poland. Reports came out today that 2 missiles, Russian missiles, landed in Poland, our NATO ally. If that proves to be true, what does the U.S. do? What's your take on that?
I mean, the reality is that Article 5 is not an automatic snap to World War III provision. So people are reading Article 5 wrong. It doesn't. If Poland were to say we want all of NATO to consider with us going to war with Russia, then it would be considered under NATO rules. But it's not as though if Poland decides to unilaterally go to war with Russia, we're all dragged in. I mean, there actually has to be a consideration and a consultation. That's how this stuff sort of works. So everybody on Twitter who's going crazy, it's not World War III. Nobody's going to have nuclear war. Everybody calm down and have a bowl of cereal tonight. It'll all be fine. You know, the reality on what should be done, my guess is that, you know, NATO should keep doing what it's doing. It's pretty obvious that Putin did this by accident. I don't think Putin wants to drag Poland into a war and get directly involved with NATO forces, considering that the Ukrainians are kicking the shit out of him. Wait until NATO gets involved. I mean, like, the thing that's hysterically funny about all of this, of course, is that, you know, we're acting in the West as though Putin is staring us down. I mean, Putin is not really staring us down. Again, he's getting beat by a second-rate military because he runs a third-rate military. But does that mean that there shouldn't be an off-ramp somewhere here? There should be an off-ramp because, again, if you want to avoid the kind of worst scenario, sometimes you have to go with the second worst scenario. With that said, what should NATO do? I could see a world in which NATO fires a couple of cruise missiles into, you know, a military target somewhere just to show Russia, like, don't do this again. But this is not going to escalate to full-scale warfare. I can guarantee you it's not going to escalate to it. Now, if I'm wrong, then the good news is that I'm up in Michigan, so ain't nothing hitting up here.
If I may, one quick comment on the trans debate discussion. My only confusion for me, growing up, sex and gender were kind of just interchangeable in terms of the way that you talk about it. Now it seems like gender is a substitute for personality or
so the way that they work
like
it,
that,
yeah,
I don't know.
It's a game. So it's a shell game. So what they do is they say sex is your biological sex. Gender is a basket of attributes that apply to one sex, but the only reason they apply to the one sex is because of societal expectations. So your gender is completely separate from your sex. The reason that girls like dolls is not because there's any built-in inclination to like dolls, it's because society has made them like dolls, right? And so that's their gender. Their gender has been forced on them from society. So that means that if a little girl biologically starts to do boy things, then this means that she is gendered male. But then they make the further step, which is the only thing that is important about a person is not their biological sex, it is their gender. So now we have to pretend that they're actually male, like biologically male. Okay, so what they do is they say gender is separate from sex. Then they say that gender is more important than sex, so sex doesn't exist. And it's a bizarre linguistic shell game. But the reality is that when you ask for clarity, all of it becomes very, very clear almost immediately. That if you're making the argument that a girl who likes trucks is a boy. That's a stupid argument. If you're arguing that there are girls who like trucks, of course there are girls who like trucks. Right? I mean, everybody understands this, but we have to pretend, along with the subjective, perception of self of every human being, that whatever you say about you is true. And by that standard, I'm a 6'3", 25-year-old strapping, muscular gentleman. I mean, like, that's none of that is true. Okay, but I guess you're all going to have to suggest that it is, because that's how I feel on the inside, or some such nonsense.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Go Blue.
Hi, Ben. I'm Seth. In recent years, China's foreign policy has been really aggressive. What do you think should happen in case of an attack on Taiwan, and what should the U.S. do about Chinese companies operating in the U.S. like TikTok?
Okay, so TikTok should be shut down in the United States. It is, in fact, a Chinese front group. It's a data gathering operation on behalf of the Chinese government. It also happens to be a giant mind virus that the Chinese have released on American soil. They have a very safe version of TikTok in China that is basically an educational tool. Over here, it's just a bunch of weirdos doing things into camera for 15 seconds and then hundreds of millions of people watching it. So that's not great. As far as China's generalized foreign policy, I'm actually less worried about a Chinese direct attack on Taiwan than I am about a blockade. I could see them calling chicken, right? Like they could just set up a naval blockade around Taiwan and basically dare us to breach the naval blockade in an attempt to get TSMC, which is the Taiwanese superconductor manufacturer, to start making sophisticated semiconductors for the Chinese. I mean, that's really what's going on as far as China-Taiwan. They've always had territorial aspirations by Taiwan, but the real conflict that's happening right now is over microchips. Right, Taiwan is the producer of 92% of the world's sophisticated microchips. Another 4 or 5% is produced in South Korea, so virtually all of them are manufactured overseas. They're all within Chinese spitting distance. China does not get any of those because we have all sorts of restrictions, so does the Taiwanese government, on shipping all of those very sophisticated semiconductors over to China. So China could theoretically try to blackmail TSMC into making sophisticated semiconductors for them by setting up a cordon around Taiwan. The only thing that can be done is long-term, you try to keep things relatively cool while you massively build up your naval power. And the United States needs to massively build up its military, massively build up its naval power, and then intimidate the Chinese into backing down. And that's really the only way you do this.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm Zach. My question is, today's news environment seems to be increasingly negative. If that is true, what advice do you have for all of us to stay informed, but also allow it not to affect us to stay positive in our daily life?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard. As a contributor to the nasty news environment, I will say that it's always been true that negative news outsells positive news. This has always been true for literally ever because it activates the fear centers of your brain. You click on it, right? I can tell you this from our own stats. Whenever we run a story about, like, nice woman saves puppy from oncoming car, like 0 hits. When it's woman eats puppy, then it's like, wow, bajillion hits, especially if she's good looking, right? That's the way the traffic works. And the dog also has to be really cute. Like, if you want to make all the elements happen here. So, and if it's AOC, and if the puppy is, anyway. So, like, we're going to add, like, as much traffic to the story as possible. So, with that said, it is imperative that you log off. I do that. I mean, I'm a news junkie, but I don't have Twitter on my phone. And I don't have Twitter on my phone because my wife looked at me and said, "You're a crazy person, and you're getting crazier. So you need to stop." And so maybe 3 years ago, I took Twitter off my phone. It doesn't mean I don't check Twitter during the day. I do to keep up with the news. But it's an active will for me to do so. It's not like I just take out my phone and just start flipping through Twitter. I actually have to think, do I want to check the news? Do I not want to check the news? Do I want to tweet is a big one, right? Because I have like 5 million followers on Twitter, so I could, say something that sets the world aflame, which is the temptation. This is why, Donald Trump with social media is a dangerous man, right? But if you're, the key is to set up obstacles for yourself. So, like, get out in the world, associate with other human beings. The internet is a wonderful place for gathering information, a very bad place for making social connections. Everybody who pretends the internet is the equivalent of a social connection is lying to you. It's not even remotely close to what actual social connection looks like.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm Adam. I take economics here, so obviously I disagree with conservatives on most things. I tend to be pretty left-leaning. My question is about the modern American conservative movement. So you have a famous saying, "Facts don't care about your feelings." That obviously drove a lot of popularity for you. Yeah, sure. I agree with that sentiment. My question is, I think polling has showed that something like 2/3 of Republicans today believe the 2020 election was stolen. It's very clear this is not just a fringe group. Like Carrie Lake, I think, was on Tucker Carlson recently and was saying that, oh yeah, my opponent is the Secretary of State. You never know, she could take votes. Obviously, I might be misquoting, but that's the general sentiment of what she said. And my question is, does that feel a little bit ironic to you that the conservative movement in America tends to portray themselves as caring very much about facts and logic, but when it comes to Daddy Trump losing an election, then all of a sudden, that's not really the case? And I'm asking in good faith because I think you said that he would destroy the social fabric or something along those lines in 2016. You said in 2020 the damage had already been done, so you were okay supporting him. And then after that, he's obviously done a lot more damage to the social fabric. So where do you stand on that?
I mean, where I stand on the election of 2020 is the same place I always stood. He lost the election of 2020. I said that the day that he lost the election of 2020. That night. Now, there are a lot of influences that I don't particularly like about the 2020 election. I don't like the media coverage. I don't like the silencing of the Hunter Biden story. I don't like the changing of the rules to allow for vast mail-in balloting, which I just on principle oppose. I think that people should go on the day of the election. They should vote on the day of the election. I don't like election month or election 2 months, right? But none of that is to say that election fraud was the cause of Donald Trump losing the 2020 election. It was not. Donald Trump was the cause of Donald Trump losing the 2020 election. He ran a very bad campaign and he lost to a person who is dead. Okay, so like that's it. So as far as I'm not going to answer for other people's perspectives that I don't share.
Sure, I'm just asking what you think the future of the conservative movement in this country
so
is.
I will say
a sizable portion believes something like
right.
that.
So first of all, I think that the way to read a lot of what's going on in politics right now is incredibly reactionary. Almost everything that's happening is just reactionary. If the media say black, then Republicans and conservatives are going to say white. And if the right says something, the left will immediately say the opposite. Right? We don't even share a common framework of facts at all. And so what the right will do very often is they'll say, I don't even understand why the left is making a big deal out of election denial. You guys were calling Stacey Abrams the governor of Georgia for years on end. Right? We did 4 years of Donald Trump was elected in 2016 because of Russian collusion that never materialized. Right? Like so this game can be played on all sides. With that said, I can say that I think all of that was bullshit, right? I think the Russian collusion stuff was not true, and I think that it was an attempt to scurrilously undermine the presidency of Donald Trump. I can also say that I think Donald Trump lost the 2020 election because he lost the 2020 election.
And so, not to interrupt, but just real quick on the Russia thing. Obviously, the idea that Trump was like this agent being controlled by Russia was stupid. No one thinks that. Or maybe some people.
Well, a lot of people at the beginning.
No
not
serious
many.
people
Yes.
who are worth sort of talking to think that. But obviously the IRA was a real thing. Russia influenced our election to the extent that they organized protests and such. And Hillary Clinton conceded the election the next day. So I think there is a meaningful distinction to make between saying that Russia influenced the election in 2016. People still knew Trump was president.
Okay,
but
so if you took polls in the aftermath of the 2016 election, you asked whether Donald Trump was an illegitimate president. Right? Not whether he was elected, whether was he an illegitimate president. A significant percentage of Democrats would say he was an illegitimate president in the aftermath of the 2016 election. I think it was something on the order of, and I'd have to check it, but it was over 30% were in the immediate aftermath saying he was an illegitimate president. And that was language that was frequently used in the aftermath of that election. Again, two wrongs don't make a right. That doesn't excuse the saying that the election was stolen and that it was stolen in a wide variety of states using unspecified methods or any of that. I'm not excusing that. The point I'm making is that we live in such a reactionary time that people are bouncing off of each other like billiard balls. And it's a real mistake, which is why, as I've said, I think that for future elections, and this is true for both parties, first party to sanity wins. First party to sanity wins. Okay, and I think that what the election of 2022 really showed is that the American people don't like a lot of what they're seeing Democrats on policy, because Republicans won by about 4.5 points in the generic ballot across the country. And they really don't like a lot of the Republican candidates who are embracing what they saw as crazy town stuff. And it was almost a targeted strike on people who they thought were saying crazy town stuff. And this is why Ron DeSantis wins by 20 in Florida, because he was just governing in Florida and doing a good job in Florida. So he took a 0.4 percentage point victory in 2018 and turned into a 20-point election victory in 2020. Mike DeWine, who, by the way, took the exact opposite view of DeSantis on COVID, won by 20 in Ohio. Anyone who's perceived as competent in their state did really well. Anybody who is perceived as not competent or crazy or off the wall did really, really poorly. And you saw this even within states, right? Chris Sununu in New Hampshire won going away in his gubernatorial race in New Hampshire. Don Baldick lost by 11 points in New Hampshire. You saw this over and over in Nevada. Right, Lombardo ended up winning. The Republican won in Nevada. Laxalt was not a bad candidate, but Laxalt was associated with Trump in some minds, and that hurt him in some ways. Right? You see this like all over the place. And so the point that I'm making is that what people actually want from Republicans is something that Republicans have to actually give them, which is a sense of stability and solidity. And many Republicans are refusing to do that. I think that's what you're pointing out. I think the mistake the Democrats are making is they're thinking that because they won 2020 and because they did better than expected in 2022, this means they now have a green light for their entire agenda. And that would be a wild misread of the tea leaves. If they decide that they're really going to double down on Elizabeth Warren-style modern monetary theory or something, they're going to blow out the spending, they're going to go soft on China, or they're going to steer in an extraordinarily environmentalist direction, or they're going to move socially liberal to the far extreme. If they do any of those things, they will get punished. It's just a question of when they're going to get punished. So that's sort of, I think where things stand.
I mean, I disagree with a lot of what you said there on the performance of Republican politicians in their respective states. The point I was making was a little bit more broad than just day-to-day politics, which is that I think what Trump has done to the trust in institutions, specifically in elections, is pretty irreparable. I think it's going to be around for election cycles to come, and I don't think it's comparable to what Democrats are doing.
I will say I don't think that that's true. That part I don't think is true. And the reason I don't think that's true is how fast did candidates, except for Kari Lake, concede that they lost the elections?
That's fair. Yeah, that's definitely fair, but I'm talking more about the voting public.
Right,
So,
and you're not hearing from the, I'll take a
weigh.
poll. How many of you, you can be honest, I'm sure some of you think this. How many of you think that the election of 2022 was stolen? Like, show of hands. Not a ton of people. There's some. Okay, but statistically not super significant in a room of 1,000 people. Okay, so maybe they're scared because I said it, but
60% of Republicans, according to polling, something like 50 to 70%.
Again, I'm saying that Trump, the Trump election, every poll about Trump is, if you ask a question that makes me feel bad about Trump, I will just tell you the opposite. That's every poll about Trump ever, right? They'll be like, they can ask literally anything. It'll be like, has Trump been married 3 times? And if it's asked by the New York Times, they'll be like, no, he has not been married 3 times. Ever. Yeah, in fact, he's married only once to Melania forever. Like Republicans will just tell the New York Times to stiff itself. I mean, that's really what it is. And so I think that a lot of those poll numbers, I'm not pretending that the phenomenon isn't real, it is real. But I do think it's transient. I think a lot of it is in reaction to people they think hate them. And that is going to have to come back together somehow. But I don't think that, I don't think that 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 8 years from now, barring Trump, right? I think Trump is a wild card in all this. Let's say there's another nominee, and the Republican nominee loses. Do I think it's going to be the same thing again? I don't. I don't think we saw it this time.
I mean, I disagree, but I don't want to take up any more time.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Ben. I wanted to get a little bit away from politics for a second and ask about what to look for in a spouse. So I'm from a... Oh, shut up. So I'm from a traditional Middle Eastern community in Brooklyn, and a lot of people that I've spoken to tell me, the way you fall in love is, somebody takes on certain roles, the traditional roles, taking care of your house, raising your children. And then I listen to people like Jordan Peterson who will say that, you find somebody that, you have to contend with, or Jonathan Haidt, who speaks about the progression from the romantic love period to compassionate love, to companionate love period.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess my question is, outside of sharing the same values religiously and politically, what should you look for in a spouse to, ensure that the relationship will flourish after that romantic love period?
So I think that it's a great question. Obviously, you named the biggest thing that people, and that is the thing that people miss, by the way, right? The way that people date is for the romantic love, and they don't think about the companionate love or the sharing of the values. So you actually took most of the question off the table, because you were like, here's all the important stuff. Tell me about the not important stuff. So among the non-important things, but they're still important. Obviously, there has to be sexual compatibility and attraction between you and your spouse. Right? That's an important thing. Pretending that it doesn't exist is really foolish. Now, when I say sexual attraction and compatibility, I would hope that you wait to find out whether there is compatibility until after you're married. Right? So the idea of sexual attraction is very important. But I'm an advocate of traditional marriage, which means I'm an advocate of virginity until marriage. I have been my entire life. I was a virgin until I was married. My wife was a virgin until we were married. We were both happy, very happy for that. Because one of the things that it did is it actually meant that we had to respect each other as human beings before we actively became sexual with one another. We actually had to make a lifelong commitment to each other before we were going to give each other that part of ourselves. So I think that's a really important thing. As far as other attributes, somebody you can have fun with, somebody who's able to handle crisis would be a really good attribute. C.S. Lewis talks about sort of the different attributes of men and women. One of the attributes that he points out is that under stress, men tend to recede. Men tend to be like, okay, I'm going to go silent. This is what happens during stressful situations. And women tend to become more active. And so they help, right? But the way they help is by annoying you, right? And for men, the way that they help is by like running away to the man cave and brooding, right? And So finding a spouse who's actually able to understand those differences is very difficult, and if you can find it, absolutely phenomenal. Communicating with your spouse is really, really important. I mean, I've told a bunch of stories about me and my wife and how we have these sort of gaps from time to time, and one of the things I love about my spouse is that I will actually sit with her and I'll be like, okay, I'm a man, I don't understand what's going on, I need you to explain this to me like I'm a small child. And thank God she will. I mean, she's very, giving that way. And I think that open line of communication is really great. Having a sense of humor, being goofy is really necessary. Life is rough, and particularly after you have kids. Kids are wonderful. I have 3 of them. They're also a giant pain in the ass, and they're extraordinarily tiring. And so if you don't have a sense of humor about your kids or about your life, it's going to be real rough. So having a sense of humor is a big thing.
Thank you. You're the man.
This will be our final question.
Okay, so I was raised very pro-choice, and now I am a pro-life advocate. I'm involved in the movement. And one of the things that the organizations I've been involved with, we talk about making abortion illegal and unthinkable, making it, because we don't want people to feel like they're being targeted, like their rights are being taken away. But how do we get to that step when, a lot of the other side just won't even talk to us?
So when people won't talk to you, then don't waste your breath. I mean, that's always rule number 1 in any conversation. You can't talk through a wall. It's not something that works. So try to recognize when a conversation is worthwhile, when a conversation is not worthwhile, just as a tactical matter. As far as, talking to people who are open to it, and a lot of these points as well as I do, but, to me, the single best point in favor of the pro-life position is always going to be the innate value of human life, and the best way to show that is an ultrasound. Ultrasounds are just astonishing. The quality of the ultrasounds is so unbelievably high at this point. For folks who haven't seen an ultrasound recently, they don't look like when you were a baby and your parents were taking an ultrasound of you and just look a bunch of static and somebody pointing at the static and going, oh, look, there's his hand. That's not what they look like at all. They're amazing. We've gotten ultrasounds in the recent past. Let me just tell you, they are just spectacularly good. And that means that from the time that the baby is 4, 5, 6 weeks, you can see actual detail in the womb. And it's very difficult after you see that detail to say, oh, it's just a cluster of cells with no inherent meaning. It's just a big bag of nothing. And so I think that will continue to be telling. Listen, I think that the pro-lifers are going to win. I think it's going to be incremental. It's going to take time. But I do think that pro-life is going to win. I think that the mistake pro-lifers can make, as I say before, is being non-tactical. Failure to use tactics is a mistake politically in terms of the law. But you don't have to argue tactically. You can argue for your position. You can argue for the full pro-life position. And as you say, making abortion unthinkable is a moral and not only moral but necessary thing to do. And so God bless you for being a pro-life advocate, and for everyone else in the room who's a pro-life advocate, thank you for doing what you're doing. You're making a world of difference.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And try to survive World War III. Was that it, or we have one more?
That's it. Thank you guys all for coming out today. Drive safely. Go Blue.
Thank you.